Are you tired of feeling overwhelmed by your emotions? Do you find yourself getting triggered easily and reacting in ways that you later regret? Welcome to the Transformational Peace podcast, and I'm Dr. Lee. In this episode, we will talk about the challenges of being emotionally triggered and the impact it can have on our lives. And thank you for clicking on this video, and if it provides you with encouragement, please click the subscribe or follow button below. Also, please share this video with someone you feel might find this information helpful. Hello friends, thanks for joining me, and today we'll be discussing emotional triggers in everyday life, tips for staying calm. Emotional triggers are specific events, situations, words, or even objects that cause us to experience intense emotional reactions. These triggers are often linked to past experiences or unresolved issues in which we experience strong emotions such as anger, fear, or sadness. Identifying and understanding our emotional triggers is an essential step in managing our emotional responses and developing healthier coping mechanisms. By recognizing these triggers, we can learn to respond more rationally and constructively in challenging situations, leading to improved emotional well-being. So in this video, I'm going to talk about three important areas in relation to being emotionally triggered. First, I'm going to talk about what being emotionally triggered looks like. Second, I'm going to talk about what causes us to get triggered. And third, I'm going to make some recommendations on how to better deal with being emotionally triggered. So first, being triggered in its simplest form is when we respond with an intense fear or anger to a situation related to something in the present. We're literally calm one moment, and the next moment we are catapulted into despair. Clearly, being triggered is not only counterproductive, but often leaves us exhausted, experiencing very powerful emotions. And the interesting part here, these powerful emotions are clearly not warranted by what triggered us or the precipitating event. As we're triggered over and over again, conditioning sets in, and often we typically become more anxious, worried, and angry more frequently. This clearly sets a precedent for future difficulties when, quite frankly, a casual, objective evaluation of the triggering event could lead to a more constructive outcome. A great example of this would be when I was in our local grocery store picking up a few items. I ended up with more than a few items, gee, imagine that, so I ended up in the dreaded regular cashier line. There was a middle-aged man in front of me who had already placed his items on the conveyor belt, so I sectioned off my area and began placing items on the conveyor belt. And then out of nowhere, this same man began cursing and screaming loudly at the cashier. I was so stunned, I stood there with some items in my hand and simply stared at this person. At one point during this tirade, he looked at me and snarled, "What are you looking at?" I continued looking at him without saying a word. As I recall, I was looking at him to determine what level of threat he might be. Fight or flight, anyone? So, for whatever reason, he continued on for about 30 seconds more and then stated, "I'm never shopping here again," and stormed out of the store without taking his groceries with him. Interestingly enough, as I regained my composure and looked around, I noticed that quite a few other people had stopped what they were doing and were watching the show. As the cashier had cleared all of his items out and began checking out my items, I moved forward and asked her if she was okay. She seemed visibly shaken. She responded yes, and I realized that she was a familiar cashier who had always been polite and courteous. And it goes without saying, this was a clear and confusing example of someone who had gotten triggered for some unobvious reason. So, some of you might be asking, what causes us to be triggered? And that brings us to the second part of our video. Emotional triggers are truly our personal guide to our past histories. Consequently, we often follow an emotional path that was set from our distant past where, unfortunately, some of us were possibly victims of painful, traumatic experiences or simply unmet needs. Unfortunately, these past experiences or painful wounds are the filters through which we view our present experience. In other words, this means that the present situation or trigger often elicits from us quick, unfortunate responses formed by our past experiences, which we are usually unaware of. Some of the most seemingly insignificant things can often trigger us. It could be a vague or confusing email that we are unclear about that we often read into most dire of scenarios. Or it could be hearing of a tragic circumstance to someone we recently met and possibly don't know that well that could thrust us into sadness or fear. And as we view our outer world through our inner prism, which is largely unconscious or out of our awareness, we create undue expectations of ourselves based on our past experiences. Consequently, herein lies the issue. We often misread the world currently in front of us due to the discrepancy with our inner world of past experiences, which creates exaggerated emotional expectations. This difference between our inner and outer world experience is what creates our disproportionate or triggered emotional response. Our emotional triggers literally contain our map of past traumatic events in our lives. And here is the interesting thing about triggers. When we are triggered and taken back to our past emotional trauma or neglect, we fail to have an awareness of or acknowledge the difference between prior younger experiences and our present experience. So in essence, the trauma we experienced long ago is often magnified through our present, often harmless or innocuous situation. I'll give a small example here. Let's imagine growing up as a small girl and we were quite attractive, and we knew this because this is what others told us. And let's further imagine that because this brought us much attention, we had a mother who was quite jealous, and because of this, we were treated with neglect and emotional distance. Now let's further imagine as we grew up and became an adult, every time, especially with the advent of social media, we saw a picture of an attractive female, we began to doubt, become self-critical, or even condemn ourselves. I think we can see from this example how clearly triggers can happen. So triggers in and of themselves aren't necessarily that powerful. We make them that powerful. And the question here becomes, how do you stop being triggered? First and foremost, we have to understand how the trigger mechanism works. Basically, we're triggered when our mind believes that it recognizes a threatening or a dangerous situation, whether the situation is threatening or not. At this point, our past experience, whether we're aware of it or not, informs us that we should be fearful or angry at whatever we're experiencing at that moment. So in essence, our current experience is being filtered through our past pain and our past unmet needs. And if we allow ourselves to remain present with this type of awareness of the emotional trigger we are experiencing, that which we don't understand can then be understood. Again, for example, let's imagine we have significant abandonment issues from our past experiences of our childhood. So we at least know that we are carrying around a sensitivity to a certain level of loss when people come in and out of our lives. And we have that one day where someone whom we have a fairly significant relationship with suddenly stops speaking to us. And when we experience this immediate sense of loss, we can begin to realize that this loss is touching a much deeper wound. It is then that we have an opportunity to understand the magnitude of the intense emotional reactions we are having. Even if we are screaming, yelling, detaching, or dissociating, we can begin to learn that something much larger than this current injury or trigger is occurring. What we can also realize is at that moment, we are re-experiencing some of the times we've been abandoned or pain from trauma we have carried with us. And it is at these times that we can be the most self-critical and tell ourselves things about ourselves that, quite frankly, are not true. We need to learn how to understand what triggers us and begin to take steps to lessen our self-harming responses. And with this understanding, we can ask ourselves not necessarily what we are afraid of or worried about, but how can we learn to distinguish between helpful and unhelpful responses to our triggers? We can, within this distinction, learn how in our most troubled moments that our present emotional trigger isn't being handled by the adult part of us, but by a past experience from a younger age that was less emotionally sophisticated. Okay, so I hope that's helpful to understand what emotional triggers look like and how they operate. And now for the third part of the video, recommendations to better deal with emotional triggers. And step number one is breathing. Remember, once we have become triggered, our emotional response can reach levels of hyperarousal. This level can trigger our fight or flight or freeze response. So practice taking a deep breath and exhaling at half the pace or much slower than when you inhaled. Do this until you can begin to feel your body relaxing and calming down. We have to learn to slow ourselves down so we can connect with what we are feeling and experiencing at that moment. And remember, practice, practice, practice. It may feel a little weird at first, but remember, we all have to start somewhere. We need to train our bodies on how to breathe in order to more effectively calm ourselves down. Try to practice regulated breathing when you aren't being triggered and get really good at it. And if you recall from my earlier videos, regulated breathing activates the vagus nerve and increases our vagal tone. Better vagal tone has many benefits in keeping our bodies in a calm and relaxed state. And number two, practice being present with your awarenesses when you are being triggered. Try to take an observer position with yourself and try to be aware of what you are telling yourself when you're being triggered. By staying present, we can stay more alert and attentive to what we are feeling and experiencing at that moment. This doesn't necessarily mean that we will automatically catch ourselves being fearful or angry when we are being triggered. However, what it does mean is that when we become more present, the time period that elapses between when we become triggered and become fearful or angry becomes shorter and shorter. And ultimately, we can reach a point where only a few seconds have elapsed after we have been triggered, as opposed to noticing long after being triggered has occurred. The goal here is to become more immediately aware of what we're experiencing so that we can be proactive with our experience. Again, let's use our early example of when we are dealing with issues of abandonment. Let's imagine that we have just texted our significant other whom we've been in a serious relationship for a significant amount of time. Now, let's further imagine that we've texted our significant other and a couple of hours have passed. Now, somewhere in those 2 hours, we begin telling ourselves that this person isn't interested in us anymore, or they may be abandoning us. The key here is having a presence and awareness such that we notice and acknowledge that we've been triggered. It is at this moment, through the presence and raised awareness, that we can begin to teach ourselves and learn. We can recognize and tell ourselves that this is our primary earlier experience of being abandoned, which is why we are feeling hurt or angry. And the more we practice being present from an observer position, we can begin to understand our triggering pattern. At this point, we can entertain a different narrative and tell ourselves things like, maybe they were just busy and didn't see my text, or maybe they were in a meeting with something important and they're not abandoning me at all. Well, that's it for this video, and thanks for watching. I hope this video has provided you with some encouragement and skill for life. And remember, we aren't great because we failed, we're great because failure hasn't stopped us. Grace and peace unto you. I'm Dr. Lee.